We've heard a lot today of people's personal knowledge of David's characteristics and how amazing he was to work with and the amazing achievements that he made. And in this last slot before tea, I didn't want to repeat any of those, but I wanted to add some further of his characteristics in my talk. And I thought, well, we haven't heard much about his management style. So David was a very shy person, as you know. He couldn't say boo to a goose. So we have no actual documentation of his management style, but I have looked at the literature and come up with the nearest that I could get to how I saw his management style.
Perkins. Sorry to drag you away from the fun, old boy.
That's all right, sir.
War's not going very well, you know.
Oh, my God.
We're two down, the ball's in the enemy court.
Sir?
War's a psychological thing, Perkins, not like a game of football.
Yes, sir.
You know how in a game of football, 10 men often play better than 11?
Yes, sir.
Perkins, we're asking you to be that one man.
Sir.
Perkins,
Sir.
I want you to lay down your life.
Yes, sir.
We need a futile gesture at this stage. It'll raise the whole tone of the war. Get up in a crate, Perkins.
Sir.
Hop over to Bremen.
Yes, sir.
Take a shufti.
Sir.
Don't come back.
Right, right.
I think anybody who worked with David, with him as their boss, would recognise that tone of voice. To David, especially in the early years of all this, the research was very definitely a war effort. We were on a war footing, and a great deal was expected of us. Right, now for this poor Perkins victim, I'll get down to the serious stuff. These were words that David used at an event to celebrate the Medical Research Council a few months before he died. And in speaking these words, he was putting forward a message that was the same message he'd been putting forward for about 25 years. Because from the point at which he linked cardiovascular disease, diabetes, other chronic diseases, to birth weight, geographically to neonatal mortality, he was convinced that these diseases lay in poor nutrition of mothers, leading to poor fetal development. And that led on to the programming hypothesis. And with the programming hypothesis came the possibility of preventing these diseases in a completely new way, which we have called primordial prevention. And the reason for that is that usually when thinking about preventing diseases like cardiovascular disease or diabetes, the efforts are targeted in later life, in adults, people who are usually already obese, already have impaired glucose tolerance, and from a developmental perspective, have reached an end stage of the disease, at a point where there's very little plasticity left to enable change. Those efforts will, of course, give benefit to the individual concerned, although that benefit may be limited, but it won't do much to stall the epidemics of these diseases that we're seeing, and it won't do anything to prevent the transmission of disease to the next generation, as we see in gestational diabetes and the effects that that has on the next generation. So for me, the holy grail of DOHAD, if you like, is to harness the plasticity of this early part of life in order to prevent disease. And whether that can be done or not is not yet known in human beings. So the future of the science that David inspired for me is to A, prove that by intervening in that early stage of life, you can prevent disease. B, find out what interventions work, and C, work out how to implement them. And as epidemiologists, we've gone through a set of stages working towards that holy grail, starting, of course, with the historic cohorts, which showed the link between low birth weight and diabetes. These cohorts were tremendously important, but had much too little data on the mother, on nutritional factors, on other metabolic factors, for us to get any idea of the most important upstream causative factors for that poor fetal development. So the next stage was to set up new prospective cohorts in which the mother and the mother's lifestyle and environment was studied in much greater detail. From there, and I would say this is the point where we are majoring now, is randomized controlled trials to try and show exactly that by intervening and changing something for the mother and the fetus, you can have a long-term impact. Ultimately, we hope there will be public health impact. To some extent, that is here already in a general way. Mark talked about the United Nations and WHO recognizing this field of research and being very interested in it, but not really at this point knowing if the evidence is strong enough and knowing what to do. Mechanisms also, this is not supposed to be an exhaustive list of the potential mechanisms of DOHAD, but it will be important for going to this step that the mechanisms are worked out. And I've mentioned epigenetics because it's particularly relevant to my work. It's one of the mechanisms which you would need to have to prove programming. That is some mechanism by which the human body retains a memory of what happened in fetal life, and that retained memory has an effect later on in life. Very early in this story, David had the vision to decide that we should be doing research in low-income countries. These are the countries where low birth weight and smallness for gestational age are the biggest problem. And the countries there with the darker colours are the countries where this is the most prevalent. If I showed you a map of maternal stunting, maternal undernutrition, maternal illiteracy, low age of childbearing, then the map would look very similar to this. And all of those factors are important in fetal development. These countries are also, as the world over, experiencing rise in obesity. I wouldn't call it obesity in many of these countries, increasing adiposity. And that adiposity superimposed on the poor start in life, the smallness for gestational age, the maternal undernutrition, is having a very devastating effect. And these same countries are experiencing now the most rapid rise in adult chronic disease. This is a map of diabetes in 2007. The darker the colour, the more diabetes. This is what is predicted to happen by 2025. And if I flip back between the two slides, you can see that the whole world is becoming darker. Diabetes is increasing everywhere. Kent mentioned it in the USA. But some places are becoming darker faster. And for example, the increase in India, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South America are expected to be of the order of 80 to 100%. In India, resulting in 80 million people with diabetes. And this compares with the much lesser rise we're seeing in the westernized countries. So if you wanted to set out with a world mapper view of the world to study low birth weight and its effect on diabetes, then the path leads very strongly to India, which has the smallest babies in the world and has become the world capital of diabetes. And after a Perkins moment, I was given the chance to start a program of research in collaboration with groups in India. And unlike poor Perkins, I consider it an enormous privilege to have spent the last 20 years or so doing that. Now, one of the first new prospective studies that we started there was with my great collaborator Ranjan Yagnik, who many people here know, the Pune Maternal Nutrition Study, which was among about 3,000 rural pregnant women who were recruited before they became pregnant, and whom we then followed the 700 who became pregnant through pregnancy. This is one of the observations in that study, that women who were eating more green leafy vegetables, more fruit and more milk had heavier babies and babies that were better grown in all dimensions. Now, these are just associations in an observational study, but they were very robust. They were very robust to adjustment for all the possible confounding factors that could otherwise have explained this. And so we decided to make these foods the intervention in the first trial that we undertook in India. That was the Mumbai Maternal Nutrition Project, terribly unimaginative title, which soon got changed to Project Saras in Mumbai, meaning excellent. This was a randomized controlled trial. We decided to use food, green leafy vegetables, fruit and milk to improve the mother's diet quality. And that was a controversial decision, and we could have an endless debate about the wisdom of doing that as opposed to using the much simpler way of giving tablets. But the real unique selling point of this trial that I want to highlight is that it started preconceptionally. Because everything that we knew from the work here of Tom Fleming and Mark Hansen was that if we were going to alter the long-term outlook, if we were going to demonstrate DOHAD effects, we would have to cover the periconceptional period in the first trimester. We had to cover embryonic development, we had to cover organogenesis, placentation, and the very dramatic epigenetic changes that occur around the time of conception. Now, to carry out this trial involved developing a way of making it possible to give these foods across a large area of a city in a way that was safe and palatable. And these snacks that we finally designed for the trial were made with the help of Barry Margetts and Alan Jackson. And a panoply of recipes were developed which could be cooked fresh each day and sent out over a 13 by 13 kilometre area for the trial. It took place in a slum area about, as I say, 13 kilometres square. We recruited 6,500 non-pregnant women and collected data on them at baseline. They were then randomized to the treatment or control snacks. The control snacks were made of vegetables of low micronutrient content, which they had for 6 days a week. And of those 6,500 women, just over 2,000 became pregnant. Their fetal size was measured 3 times during pregnancy, and the supplements continued until delivery, and just under 2,000 births took place and were measured. These results are quite new. Some people will have seen them. These are the results from the group of women who had the supplement as we planned for at least 3 months before they became pregnant. On the left here, you can see the difference between the control and treatment groups, taking all of the women as a whole. There was a 45-gram increase in the treatment group. This was significant, but quite a modest increase in birth weight, but actually about what you see if you give multiple micronutrient tablets starting in pregnancy. The interesting thing was if you split the women up into groups of body mass index, and there we saw an interaction with maternal BMI such that in the thinnest underweight women there was no difference between the treatment and control groups. But as maternal BMI increased, that difference increased to around 100 grams difference. Now this trial clearly showed something happening to birth weight. It showed something surprising that we can't explain. For some reason, the thinnest women appeared unable to use those nutrients or that food to help the fetus to grow. We don't understand the reason for that, and that's a question that has been raised by the trial. But it clearly had an effect, and it also reduced gestational diabetes in the mothers, which was an unexpected finding. It halved the prevalence. Now comes what I think of as the real proof of the pudding, because what we're looking for here is long-term effects of this intervention. The children have been followed up regularly through infancy and early childhood, and we have just started a study at the age of 5 years in which we're going to measure some of these longer term outcomes at an age where we think we should see an effect if the intervention has affected the long term for these children. So we've been measuring growth, we'll be measuring body composition, glucose tolerance and insulin resistance, blood pressure and cognitive function. That trial will take another 3 years before we know the results. But it is the first trial that has set out from before conception to test David's ideas. Now, at the bottom of that list there, I've put epigenetics. Later on this afternoon, Keith Godfrey is going to give a talk purely on epigenetic studies. And there isn't time for me to do that, and he's a much better person to do it. But I've put it there just to highlight the fact that epigenetic mechanisms, as Kent has already said, are at the cutting edge of DOHAD. And it would be sheer negligence to do a periconceptional trial and not to look for epigenetic effects. So they will be a strong part of that follow-up at 5 years. They're also part of the second trial, which has just started, the Pune vitamin B12 trial. This also came out of observations that we made in the cohort studies, that vitamin B12 deficiency was extremely common in India, that it was associated with low birth weight, and that it was associated with differences in glucose tolerance and insulin resistance in the children. So this is a trial of B12 compared against standard care, but also with a group that is containing other micronutrients. Now this is really setting out to be an omics study, the omics of fetal programming. And therefore we're not just looking at women, we're also looking at men, because epigenetic effects can potentially be transmitted through fathers as well as through mothers. And great effort is being made in a very remote rural area to make sure that fresh placental samples, fresh cord blood samples, etc. are being collected in this trial. Now this is at the cutting edge. This is the rocket science, if you like, of DOHAD. But I want to lead us away from the rocket science for the last few minutes of the talk. When we started the Pune maternal nutrition study, we looked at a lot of characteristics of the mothers in that population. And it was very obvious that many of the characteristics of them and their lifestyles could in no way be conducive to successful fetal growth. The mothers were most of them were underweight. They were young. The average age of marriage then was 18. They were poorly educated. They entered a hierarchy when they married, which gave them very little influence on what food was bought in the household. They traditionally took the hardest work. They ate last after the elders and the children. They, by tradition, fasted 1 or 2 days a week. There was a lot of pressure to have a child as soon as possible after marriage, and this was an element of stress in their lives. There are many things here that we know already are not good for fetal growth. We don't need to trial these things. In different ways, we could say the same of every population on Earth. We can certainly say it about the Southampton population too, that many women are not optimally prepared for pregnancy. It isn't yet a norm anywhere. A few months before he died, David sent me a very interesting article called Fast Ideas and Slow Ideas by Atul Gawande in the New Yorker. He talked about how some ideas, some solutions go viral and spread very fast, and others take a long time. And an example of a fast idea was anesthesia, which was demonstrated for the first time using ether in 1846 in Boston. It was published the same year, happy days. It was in use in London and Paris within a year. Within a year, it was also in use in major cities around the world, and in 10 years, it was in use in every country. As a slow idea, he took asepsis for surgery. So Pasteur linked putrefaction to microbes in 1865, and Lister showed, using carbolic acid a year later, that you could clean wounds, clean instruments, and dramatically drop surgical mortality. It was published a year after that. But 20 years later, it was reported that surgeons are still operating in blood-encrusted frock coats and reusing unsterilised instruments. So that took about 30 years before it became very widespread. Then he took an even slower idea, maternal and newborn care. So 1845, Semmelweis discovered that hand washing reduces maternal deaths from puerperal sepsis. Now, I haven't found out when it was discovered that undernourished mothers have poorly grown babies, or micronutrient deficiency in mothers has an impact on the next generation, or that breastfeeding improves infant survival. It was certainly a long time ago. And yet, in 2014, mothers in poor countries are lucky if they are adequately nourished. They're lucky, actually, if they have a trained birth attendant and even know the birth weight of their baby. So again, this preparation and care in pregnancy has not become a norm around the world in the same way as that fast idea. He contrasted some of the characteristics of fast ideas and slow ideas. Anesthesia tackled a very visible enemy, pain. It was a short-lived task of immediate benefit to both the surgeon and the patient. It was high-tech at the time. It was given by high-status operators, and it required very little in the way of systems and organisation. Whereas maternal and newborn care, on the other hand, is tackling invisible enemies, poor nutrition, sepsis. It requires multiple, very unremarkable tasks at multiple stages, and the results are pretty invisible or take months or years to be detectable. Much of it is low-tech, much of it is administered by low-status staff, and it needs complicated systems and crossing multiple sectors. And Atul Gawande wrote about how part of the problem is that these unremarkable, unsexy tasks and the reason for doing them are not communicated well either to the mothers who would benefit from them in a way that they can understand or be persuaded by, and are not communicated well to those low status staff who are often given a quick training, sent off into the middle of nowhere and told to get on with it, and have little in the way of factors to motivate them or to make them ensure that every time they see a mother, they do this sequence of unsexy tasks. So he said, we yearn for frictionless technological solutions, but people talking to people is still the way that norms and standards change. Now, I feel that a norm has to change here, and that the science of people talking to people is going to be a very key part of taking David's ideas to fruition. And the science of people talking to people needs to happen at lots of different levels, from mothers, nursing staff, health workers, to policy leaders. And that's a science that we have started increasingly working on within the unit, and Mary Barker will be talking more about that later. Another example of that approach is a study that's in the planning stage by Sarah Kehoe in our unit, who's going to carry out a value chain analysis of micronutrient-rich foods in India. Now, value chain analysis is a very fancy term for people talking to people all along the food chain from the farm to the household, and talking to people who have understanding of these sequences, like agriculturalists and economists and social scientists, and working out why it is that in poor countries mothers don't get enough of these foods at the right time and in the right places, and working out the best ways to modify those chains so that the situation is improved. I'm going to finish there. I just want to say that David took enormous interest in the many studies in India that I haven't had time to talk about. He loved to be in the field, seeing the populations where the data was being collected. He was very interested in people's lives, and he always had sharp observations that were helpful. And the other great thing we've heard today, how he communicated and gelled and engaged people at all levels, one-to-one and the entire world. And that was an amazing characteristic of his. He's hiding there. And he was responsible for this outburst of laughter, which was always a hallmark of travelling together with David. And finally, I would like to thank all the people that I work with in Southampton and in India. Thank you.